seemed like an ordinary evening at the Blind Beggar pub on Whitechapel Road. Two men had just entered and ordered some light ales before sitting on stools next to the bar. One of them is George Cornell, associate of notorious gang run by the Richardson Brothers. Unaware of how life was about to change for many, the two men kept chatting. Moments later, two men approached them. Cornell sneered, "Well, just look who's here." But before another word escaped, two gunshots shattered the air, followed by another straight to his forehead. The assassin walked out calmly, leaving behind shock and silence. It's March the 9th, 1966, a day that marked not only the bloody climax of a fierce gang war, but the downfall of the infamous Kray twins after Ronnie Kray got sentenced to life imprisonment for this execution. What led to this cold-blooded execution? To unravel the events that built up to this moment, we need to step back 6 years. The gritty streets of 1960s London were ruled by two powerful forces, the Kray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, who dominated the East End, and the Richardson Brothers, Charlie and Eddie, who held sway over the criminal activities of South London. As the dictum goes, two swords cannot stay in one sheath. Given that both were looking to expand their illicit businesses, rivalry was bound to emerge. However, it didn't have to turn into a fully fledged war. The Kray twins, infamous for their ruthless tactics and undeniable flair for theatrics, were the public face of London's criminal underworld. Known for their sharp suits, business ventures and celebrity connections, Ronnie and Reggie Kray didn't just rule through fear, they also courted fame. They had the charm and ability to blend into high society, attending glitzy events and rubbing shoulders with celebrities, politicians and even the press.
The Krays nightclubs attracted celebrities like Christine Keeler. Judy Garland was another visitor. The twins themselves enjoyed celebrity status until a crackdown on London's gangs ended with both being driven away from the Old Bailey, jailed for life for the murders of George Cornell and Jack the Hat McVitie.
Their relationship with politicians was instrumental in keeping them away from prison. In a hushed scandal, Conservative parliamentarian Lord Boothby even tried to use Parliament to protect Ronnie and his twin. But beneath that polished exterior, they were ruthless, unpredictable, and utterly unafraid to use violence to maintain their grip on power. Their legendary notoriety garnered various movies and books. Here is a trailer of a recent one.
Trying to tell you is that he's off his rocker.
Well, no.
It was time for the Krays to enter gangster legend.
It looks like Tom Hardy has outperformed himself in this one, isn't it? Coming back to London's underworld. While not as flamboyant, the Richardson gang was just as feared. Their reputation built on ruthless efficiency and cold business acumen. Led by brothers Charlie and Eddie Richardson, they controlled South London with a more business-like approach. Their enterprise was built on extortion, fraud, and most infamously, torture. Unlike the Krays, who were seen in the media as London's celebrity gangsters, the Richardsons kept a lower profile, focusing more on running their operation efficiently than on courting the public eye. They operated like a well-oiled machine, and their brand of brutality was terrifyingly methodical. Torture was a routine tool of intimidation within the Richardson gang, which ultimately brought their downfall. But that's not the subject of today's episode. So let's get back to the 1960s London underworld. While the Krays and the Richardsons held power in different parts of the city, it was inevitable that their paths would cross. The underworld of London was too small to accommodate two criminal enterprises of such magnitude. Their initial relationship was cautious. An uneasy truce kept them from direct confrontation for a time, but tension simmered just beneath the surface. As both gangs expanded their influence, their chances to tango grew. However, things came to a head when two of the Kray gang members joined forces with the Richardsons. What began as a territorial dispute would soon escalate into violent, bloody encounters that left bodies in the streets and shocked even the hardened criminals of London's underworld. What made the Kray-Richardson feud so infamous wasn't just the scale of the violence, but the personalities involved. Ronnie Kray, prone to violent outbursts and driven by a warped sense of loyalty and revenge, was a ticking time bomb. His personal vendetta against George Cornell, a former Kray associate who had just defected to the Richardson gang, would ignite one of the feud's bloodiest chapters. On the other hand, Charlie Richardson was methodical, operating like a businessman in a cutthroat market. But even his cold calculation couldn't prevent the violence from spiralling out of control once the conflict with the Krays reached its peak. But before we jump into it, let's first explore the lives of the Kray twins. The Kray gang, known simply as The Firm, grew rapidly, making them household names. Born into a working-class family in London's East End, the twins started out as amateur boxers, a sport that would shape their early reputation. They grew up in a community where physical strength and intimidation often held as much sway as money, and the brothers quickly adapted to these values. As they transitioned from the boxing world into the world of crime, they leveraged their physical prowess and reputation for fearlessness to establish their dominance. It wasn't long before they'd built a network of loyal associates, known collectively as the Firm, who were instrumental in helping them seize control of the East End. At the heart of the Kray twins' power was their ability to run protection rackets with brutal efficiency. This meant that local businesses, from pubs to nightclubs, would pay the Firm for protection, both from the threat of violence and from any other rival gangs looking to muscle in on their territory. It was a system that relied heavily on fear. Those who dared to refuse payment often found themselves on the receiving end of the Krays' wrath. The twins were not afraid to use violence as a means to maintain control, but they were also strategic in their brutality, carefully picking their targets and making public examples of them when necessary. One of the key areas in which the Krays built their turf was London's booming nightclub scene. The 1960s saw a rise in glamorous nightclubs across the city, attracting celebrities, politicians and wealthy socialites. The Krays quickly recognised the potential of this market, using it not only as a source of income, but as a way to expand their influence. Owning or controlling nightclubs allowed them to mix with the rich and famous, further cementing their reputation as not just gangsters, but public figures who could move between the worlds of crime and high society. They operated nightclubs like Esmeralda's Barn, which became a hotspot for London's elite. Through these venues, they gained a veneer of respectability, while continuing to run their criminal activities behind the scenes. What made the Kray twins particularly dangerous was their unpredictable nature, especially Ronnie Kray. Described by many as volatile and prone to violent outbursts, Ronnie's instability made him all the more feared. His reputation for violence was well known, and he did little to hide it. There was another aspect of his life that made him the subject of innumerable gossip about his associations with men. He was gay, and after coming out, the media gossiped about his associations. This one aspect is important to know because it was the core of the incident we told you about in the start of the video. Nevertheless, unlike his more measured brother Reggie, Ronnie thrived on confrontation and chaos, traits that only fueled their notoriety. The Kray twins' willingness to use violence to settle scores meant that any challenges to their authority was quickly and often brutally dealt with. This enterprise, however, was built on more than just intimidation and violence. The Krays were also shrewd businessmen, expanding their operations into legitimate ventures alongside their criminal enterprises. They diversified their income streams by investing in properties and engaging in high-stakes fraud, further consolidating their grip on the East End. At their peak, the Krays' influence extended far beyond their local area, with connections in politics, entertainment and authority, allowing them to operate with relative impunity for years. Yet behind the allure of their public persona, the Kray twins were ruthless in maintaining their power. The Firm, under their command, engaged in extortion, robbery and elimination, all whilst keeping a tight grip on the East End. Their ability to navigate both the underworld and the upper echelons of London society made them a formidable force, one that few dared to challenge. For a time, it seemed as though nothing could stop them, as their illicit businesses grew in both size and infamy. The rise of the Kray twins and the Firm marked the beginning of one of the most notorious eras in London's criminal history. Their grip on the city's underworld, coupled with their ability to maintain an outward appearance of respectability, allowed them to build an enterprise that dominated not only the East End, but much of the city's criminal landscape. However, as their power grew, so did the cracks in their operation, setting the stage for a violent and inevitable downfall. While the Kray twins were busy building their reputations as East End celebrities, Charlie and Eddie Richardson were ruling South London with a different approach. The Richardson Brothers operated in a much quieter but no less dangerous way. Their criminal enterprise, known as the Richardson Gang, was feared for its ruthless efficiency and its business-like structure. Unlike the Krays, who were often in the limelight due to their flamboyant behaviour and connections with high society, the Richardsons preferred to stay in the shadows, building a criminal enterprise that was as profitable as it was brutal. Charlie Richardson was the mastermind behind the gang's operations. He was the older of the two brothers and known for his sharp business mind. Charlie wasn't interested in the glamour of fame that came with being a notorious gangster. He was focused purely on power and profit. Under his leadership, the Richardson gang expanded rapidly, taking control of a variety of illegal activities across South London. Eddie Richardson, though less visible than his brother, was equally ruthless. Together, the Richardson brothers created a vast network that rivaled the Krays firm, although they operated with a more calculated and controlled form of violence. One of the Richardson gang's primary sources of income was through extortion and protection rackets. Businesses in South London, much like those in the Krays territory, were required to pay the Richardsons for protection, but the price for refusing was severe. The gang was infamous for using extreme violence to enforce their rules, and their methods of intimidation were far more brutal than those used by the Krays. They even faced trial for it, that got the name torture trial. While the Kray twins cultivated an air of respectability and charm, the Richardsons made no such attempts. For those who crossed them, torture was often the penalty, with victims subjected to horrifying acts meant to send a message to others. The Richardsons were particularly notorious for their kangaroo courts, in which suspected traitors or those who had defied the gang were tried in makeshift trials. These mock courts, presided over by Charlie Richardson himself, were nothing more than a prelude to a brutal punishment. Once a guilty verdict was rendered, the gang's enforcer, Mad Frankie Fraser, would carry out the sentence, which would involve pulling out teeth with pliers, or in some cases electrocution using a field telephone. These punishments were designed to instill fear, and they were. The Richardson gang's violent reputation kept their grip on South London tight.
Well, the police say I've killed 40 people, not 41. If they'd have said 41, I'd have really been upset. I hate odd numbers. But they say 40, and they want to say that it's a free country. I won't argue.
The scope of the Richardson brothers' operation extended beyond extortion and violence. Charlie Richardson was a businessman at heart, and ensured that the gang diversified its interests. They were involved in fraud, particularly insurance scams, and also used legitimate businesses such as scrap metal yards and fruit machine companies as fronts for their illegal activities. These legal ventures allowed them to launder money and avoid some of the scrutiny that often came with being known as gangsters. For Charlie, business and crime were intertwined, and he ran the Richardson gang with the same level of professionalism as any legitimate enterprise. What set the Richardsons apart from the Kray was their approach to power and control. Where the Kray twins were often seen in the media, attending parties and cultivating a celebrity status, the Richardson brothers preferred to stay out of the public eye. Their style of leadership was less flashy, more calculated. The Richardsons were known to keep a low profile, focusing on expanding their operations without drawing unnecessary attention. They didn't care for the limelight. Their power came from their ruthless business acumen and their ability to intimidate those around them without the need for public approval. The business-like nature of the Richardson gang was also evident in the way they handled internal discipline. While the Kray twins often made emotional, impulsive decisions, particularly Ronnie, who was known for his temper, the Richardson brothers ran their operation with cold efficiency. They maintained strict control over their members and punished disloyalty severely, but always with a sense of order and structure. Charlie Richardson treated the gang like a corporation, one where dissent would not be tolerated and where fear was the primary tool of governance. Now, what went wrong to lead to all hell breaking loose? In the early days of the 1960s, before their infamous feud exploded into violence, the Kray twins and the Richardson brothers coexisted in an uneasy truce. Both gangs were powerful in their respective territories. Ronnie and Reggie held sway over the East End of London, while Charlie and Eddie Richardson controlled South London. Despite their shared ambition and desire for dominance, the two crime gangs initially managed to avoid direct conflict. At first, the Krays and the Richardsons operated with an understanding that each gang would maintain control over its own turf. This unspoken agreement allowed both groups to flourish, while the Krays focusing on their nightclubs and protection rackets in the East End, while the Richardson brothers expanded their criminal activities in South London. However, this peace was always fragile, as it was in any scenario of the Underworld. The truce was never built to last. The rivalry between the two gangs started to escalate as each sought to expand its reach and control over London's lucrative criminal enterprises. One key source of tension was George Cornell, a former associate of the Krays who had defected to the Richardson gang. His move symbolised a significant shift in power and loyalty, further straining relationships between the two gangs. Cornell's defection to the Richardson camp was far more than a business move. It was a personal betrayal that lit the fuse to an explosive showdown. And this wasn't the first time that it had happened. Earlier, Frank Fraser had done the same thing. What's more, his association with the Krays wasn't just limited to gang activities. Frank knew the twins from their childhood and was friends with their father. George Cornell was no stranger to the world of gangland crime in London. He'd once been aligned with the Krays, working alongside them in the East End, before switching his allegiance to the Richardson gang, where he became a key figure. Cornell's decision to move to the Richardson camp was significant, as it symbolised a shift in loyalty during a time when both gangs were striving to maintain their power in the criminal underworld. Known for his violent temper, Cornell was an integral part of the Richardson gang's operations, known for enforcing the gang's rules and intimidating those who crossed them. His involvement in the Richardson gang marked him as a key player in the ongoing tension between the two factions. However, it wasn't until the infamous incident at the Astor Club in December 1965 that Cornell became a direct target for Ronnie Kray's fury. During a Christmas party at the Astor Club in 1965, George Cornell publicly insulted Ronnie Kray, calling him a fat puff. It was a homophobic remark, and given Ronnie's woes regarding people's perceptions of his orientation, it was more than a punch in the face. Ronnie's sexuality was a topic of rumour and gossip in the underworld. For Cornell to insult Ronnie in such a way, in front of others, was an affront that the volatile Kray twin would not forgive or forget. While people believed this to be a reason Ronnie took out Cornell, Ronnie denied the claims and said that Cornell was threatening him and Reggie. He denied that Cornell had called him a fat puff at all. Ronnie's cousin, Kim Pete, said, "I stand by my cousin. If Ronnie hated the man, there was a reason. We don't feel guilty. If Cornell was an innocent, nice bloke, then probably. But he was a flash bloke who threatened the twins and the family and got what was coming to him." Adding to the tension between the two gangs was the presence of Mad Frankie Fraser, one of the most feared men in the Richardson gang. Fraser was a violent enforcer who carried out brutal punishments on behalf of the Richardsons, and his reputation for cruelty was legendary. So much that we cannot detail his torture techniques here because YouTube wouldn't like them. Nevertheless, what made Frankie's role in the feud particularly interesting, however, was the fact that the Kray twins initially referred to him as Uncle Frank. He must have been an asset to the Krays when he was with them. Fraser's role in the feud was multifaceted. Not only did his brutal methods contribute to some of the fearsome reputation of the Richardson gang, but his personal history with the Krays added another layer of complexity to the conflict. Despite the fact that Fraser had once been friendly with the Krays, by the time the feud was in full swing, he was firmly in the Richardson camp. His involvement in enforcing the Richardsons' rule only deepened the rift between the two gangs, and his reputation for violence meant that any confrontation involving Fraser would be particularly dangerous. Fraser was present at some of the key moments of the feud, including the infamous gunfight at Mr. Smith's nightclub, where the first significant bloodshed occurred between the two gangs. The feud between the Krays and the Richardson gang reached a violent turning point on March 7, 1966, at Mr. Smith's nightclub in Catford. This was the night when tensions between the two gangs erupted into open warfare. A confrontation broke out between the Richardsons and a bunch of local hardmen, including a Kray associate, Dickie Hart. The shootout resulted in Hart's death outside the back doors of the nightclub. The exact details of the fight are murky, but what is clear is that the incident at Mr. Smith's marked a major escalation in the feud. After word of the incident at Mr. Smith's reached the Kray twins, Ronnie decided to take action against the Richardson gang. With most of their members either in jail or in hospital, Ronnie Kray vowed vengeance for the execution of Kray associate Richard Hart. By chance, Cornell was not present at Mr. Smith's and hence not picked up by the police. This was Ronnie's moment to act. On March the 9th, 1966, just 2 days after the gunfire at Mr. Smith's, George Cornell was sitting in the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel with a friend named Albie Woods. It was a seemingly ordinary evening, but the events that unfolded that night would go down in history as one of London's most infamous gangland eliminations. Ronnie Kray had learned that Cornell was at the pub, and without hesitation, he decided to take action. Accompanied by his right-hand man, Ian Barry, and driven by Reggie's driver, John Dixon, Ronnie made his way to the Blind Beggar. They stopped along the way to pick up weapons. Cornell was rushed to the hospital soon after the attack, but his injuries were too severe and he died 2 hours later. The elimination of George Cornell sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld and the wider public. It was such a bold and brazen act, carried out in a public place with multiple witnesses, and it signalled just how far Ronnie Kray was willing to go to settle personal scores. But despite the fact that several people had seen the elimination take place, no one was willing to testify against the Krays. The reign of fear they had established in the East End ensured that silence was the only option for those who had witnessed the crime. George Cornell's elimination was a turning point in the feud between the Krays and the Richardsons, but it also marked the beginning of the end for both gangs. The elimination drew significant attention from the police and, although Ronnie Kray was initially arrested, the lack of willing witnesses meant that he was released. Meanwhile, the Krays came under increasing scrutiny from Scotland Yard, setting in motion the investigation that would eventually lead to their arrest and conviction. For the Richardson gang, the death of George Cornell was a major blow. But it wasn't the only challenge they faced in the aftermath of Mr. Smith's nightclub incident. Just months later, the Richardson brothers were arrested in connection with the infamous torture trial, which exposed the gang's brutal methods of enforcement and effectively dismantled their gang. In the end, the feud between the Krays and the Richardsons, ignited by a single insult and fueled by violence and revenge, brought both gangs crashing down. The violent rivalry between the Kray twins and the Richardson brothers had reached a boiling point by the mid-1960s. The feud between these two dominant gangs, sparked by personal insults and territorial disputes, escalated into a series of brutal confrontations that shocked even the most hardened underworld of London. However, the same brutality that fueled their rise would also be the catalyst for their eventual downfall. The violent deaths, high-profile crimes, and increasing police pressure led both the Kray and Richardson gangs to a sudden and inevitable collapse. For the Richardson brothers, the end came swiftly following the infamous torture trial in 1967, which exposed the gang's violent methods to the public. The trial revealed just how far the Richardsons would go to maintain control of their criminal groups. The torture methods employed by the gang were notorious and feared across South London. The accounts that came out during the trial painted a picture of methodical cruelty that was far beyond anything the Krays had practiced, even at their most violent. The trial uncovered some of the most extreme forms of violence, including the use of pliers to pull out victims' teeth and the infamous electrocution of the genitals using a field telephone to administer electrical shocks. During the trial, prosecuting counsel Sebag Shaw told the jury, "This case is not about dishonesty and fraud, it is about violence and threats of violence, not casual acts of violence committed in sudden anger or alarm, but vicious and brutal violence systematically inflicted deliberately and cold-bloodedly with utter and callous ruthlessness." The severity of these accusations shocked the public and the jury alike. Frank, Mad Frankie Fraser, the gang's enforcer, became notorious for his role in carrying out the torture. Fraser's actions were described as sadistic, with one witness during the trial recounted how he had been subjected to the black box torture, an ordeal in which wires were attached to his genitals and electric shocks were administered before Fraser stabbed him in the foot. While Charlie and Eddie Richardson maintained that the extent of violence had been exaggerated, the trial's verdict was decisive. Charlie Richardson was sentenced to 25 years in prison, while Eddie received 10 years on top of an existing 5-year sentence for a fray. Fraser was sentenced to 5 years for his role in the violence, and other members of the gang were similarly punished. Judge Sir Frederick Lawton, in sentencing Charlie Richardson, remarked, "One is ashamed to live in a society with men like you. It must be made clear to all of those who set themselves up as gang members that they will be struck down by the law as you will be struck down." The collapse of the Richardson group was swift. Their control over South London was shattered, and their criminal activities came to an abrupt halt as the key figures in the gang were locked away. The trial, widely publicised and sensationalised by the media, not only stripped the Richardsons of their power, but also served as a warning to others in the criminal underworld. The reign of terror that the Richardson brothers had imposed on South London came to an end in a courtroom, with many of the victims finally seeing justice served. The downfall of the Kray twins, while similarly dramatic, unfolded over a longer period. Ronnie and Reggie Kray had enjoyed years of relative impunity as their notoriety grew alongside their power. The Krays' combination of criminal activity and public visibility made them both feared and strangely admired. However, the death of George Cornell at the Blind Beggar pub in 1966 was a turning point for the twins. Ronnie Kray had openly eliminated Cornell in front of witnesses, but, for a time, no one was willing to testify against the Krays. The reign of fear they had established in the East End ensured silence among witnesses. However, the pressure on the Krays began to mount as Scotland Yard, led by Detective Chief Superintendent Leonard "Nipper" Reid, intensified its efforts to bring down the twins. Nipper, the Met legend who had become famous as the man who nicked Ronnie and Reggie, kept the twins' case for 4 years gathering evidence. He was the man who broke the wall of silence, which earlier discouraged anyone from providing information to the police about the Kray crimes. He managed it by deciding to keep the Kray twins, along with 15 other members of the firm, in May 1968, so that witnesses could come forward. While in prison, the Krays came up with a plan for members of their gang to confess to the murders, but some refused to be cajoled into pleading guilty, and a barmaid at the pub testified to seeing Ronnie eliminate Cornell. Other than witness intimidation, the major challenge was to steer clear of bent coppers who were on the gangsters' payroll while conducting the investigation. Even while picking his team, he feared that corrupt officers would get whiff of his plans, according to Nipper. "I couldn't tell them what they'd be working on, so I called them all together and locked them in a room and told them what they were about to hear was for their ears only." Another thing that helped with the downfall of the Kray twins was the grant of immunity to many self-confessed criminals who turned against the twins. Some of those criminals were already resentful at the twins, who wanted to present themselves as scapegoats to the police. Several associates, including Reggie's driver, Scotch Jack, John Dixon, and enforcer Albert Donahoe, turned on them, providing crucial testimony that would lead to the twins' arrest. The breakthrough in the case came when Reed was able to track down a key witness, the barmaid who'd been working in the Blind Beggar pub the night George Cornell was executed. After being placed under witness protection, she agreed to testify against Ronnie Kray, stating that she had seen him hit Cornell. This testimony, combined with other witness statements, finally gave the police the evidence that they needed to arrest and convict the Krays. The trial, which began in 1969, was one of the most high-profile in British criminal history. Both Ronnie and Reggie were sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that they serve a minimum of 30 years, the longest sentences ever passed at the Old Bailey for elimination at the time. Ronnie was convicted for the elimination of George Cornell, while Reggie was sentenced for the assassination of Jack the Hat McVitie, a fellow gangster who had fallen out of favour with the twins. The Krays' downfall was as dramatic as their rise. Once untouchable figures in London's criminal underworld, they now face life behind bars. Ronnie Kray was eventually certified insane and sent to Broadmoor Hospital, where he remained until his death in 1995. Reggie continued to serve his sentence in various prisons across the UK until his release on compassionate grounds in 2000, shortly before his death from cancer. The downfall of both the Kray and Richardson gangs marked the end of an era in London's criminal history. The 1960s had been a time when organised crime thrived, with gangs like the Firm and the Richardsons exerting influence over large parts of the city. Their power had grown unchecked for years, largely due to corruption within the police force and the fear they instilled in their communities. But as the violence escalated and the public grew more aware of the brutality behind the gangsters' glamorous facades, the authorities finally began to crack down. In many ways, the trials of the Krays and the Richardsons were a turning point. They showed that no matter how powerful or feared a criminal group might be, it could still be brought down by the law. The collapse of these two gangs also revealed the darker side of organised crime. The torture, elimination and ruthless exploitation that lay behind the public image of men like Ronnie and Reggie Kray or Charlie and Eddie Richardson. Richardson claimed that his conviction was inevitable. After all the publicity and lies, it would have been like having Caligula, Genghis Khan, Hitler and Stalin all in one box and taking the lid off and letting them scuttle away. His words, while intended to mock the media portrayal of the gangs, highlighted just how notorious their reputations had become. By the late 1960s, both the Krays and the Richardsons had been struck down by the law, leaving behind a legacy of violence and fear that would continue to captivate the public imagination for decades to come. By now, most of these thugs have died, including both Richardson and Kray brothers. Enmity seems to have been forgotten, as after the twins' death, here's what Fraser had to say about them.
They were good guys, they were good gangsters, if you want to use such a word. They wouldn't harm women or children, they were untouchable.
The violent reign of the Krays and the Richardsons serves as a stark reminder of a time where criminal gangs thrived in the shadows of London's streets. Their downfall exposed not only the brutality behind their operations, but also the corruption and weakness in law implementation that allowed them to grow unchecked. In the years since, significant reforms in policing, coupled with greater public awareness, have made it more difficult for organised crime to operate with the same impunity. Modern law enforcement, equipped with better resources and more sophisticated tools, is far better prepared to prevent similar criminal wars from escalating in the same devastating levels. Though organised crime still exists, the legacy of the Krays and Richardsons stands as a cautionary tale of how unchecked power, can unravel even the most notorious of figures.